In the rarefied air of the Third Reich, power cast a long and deceptive shadow. While Adolf Hitler ruled with an iron fist, the women married to his highest commanders moved in a world of reflected glory. They were not silent observers, but proud evangelists for Nazi values, their lives central to the regime's exclusive social rituals. Yet when the Reich met its ruin in 1945, their gilded world shattered. The very privilege that had defined them became a liability, and the price of their loyalty would be steep. In the suffocating air of the bunker, loyalty demanded its final terrible price. For many within the Nazi regime, Magda Goebbels was more than just the wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. She was the pristine embodiment of German womanhood. With her grace and unwavering dedication, she stood as a public symbol of Hitler's vision, a familiar presence at rallies and a figure so close to the Führer that her children saw him as a paternal figure. As the Third Reich crumbled in April of 1945, the Goebbels family made a fateful choice. While others scrambled to escape the encroaching Allied forces, Magda and Joseph descended with their 6 children, aged 4 to 12, into the Führer bunker beneath Berlin. Their belief in the cause was so absolute that they could not fathom a world that existed beyond its defeat. Here, in the earth beneath a dying city, their ideology would demand its most unnatural sacrifice. Above them, Berlin was a city under constant bombardment, the thunder of Soviet artillery drawing ever closer. Inside the concrete tomb, Adolf Hitler had already resolved his own fate, taking his life on April 30th. The very next day, on May 1st, Magda Goebbels would commit one of history's most disturbing acts of fanatical devotion. With chilling resolve, she administered poison to her 6 sleeping children, one by one. Some accounts suggest she first gave them sedatives, whispering that they were simply going to sleep before delivering the final dose of cyanide. In the end, the method mattered little. All 6 were murdered by their mother's hand. Shortly after, Magda and Joseph ascended to the ruined garden of the Reich Chancellery, where they too ended their lives and had their bodies burned, mirroring the fate of their Führer. In letters left behind, Magda explained her conviction that a world without National Socialism was unlivable for her children, that Germany's future was so bleak their lives were no longer worth living. Even amid the war's final chaotic hours, her actions sent a wave of shock through the bunker, disturbing even hardened SS officers. Yet, as Magda embraced death for her family, another woman tied to the regime was desperately fighting for a different fate. In the shadow of one of history's greatest monsters, a different kind of conviction took root. Margarete Himmler, the wife of the Reich's chief architect of terror, held a faith in the Nazi cause that was just as unyielding as her husband's. Born to a prosperous conservative family, she carried herself with the pride of her station, believing fervently in the glorious future the party promised Germany. A trained nurse, she served with the German Red Cross, and her private letters were filled with praise for Hitler and admiration for the Nazi elite. She and Heinrich raised their daughter Gudrun in a home steeped in discipline, loyalty, and rigid German values. While the full, monstrous scope of her husband's work remained shrouded from her, she attended events with other SS families and reaped the benefits of his power, living a life of insulated comfort as millions suffered. But as the Third Reich crumbled into dust, that world of privilege shattered. Heinrich Himmler attempted to vanish into the chaos of post-war Germany. Disguised as a common soldier under the alias Heinrich Hitzinger, he sought anonymity among the defeated. His flight was short-lived. Captured by the British near Bremen, his true identity was soon exposed. Rather than face a courtroom in the certainty of a hangman's noose, Himmler bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule, dying within minutes. Meanwhile, Margarete and her daughter, who had sought refuge in northern Italy, found their own war was far from over. On May 13, 1945, they were arrested. To the Allies, she was not merely the spouse of a high-ranking official. She was an active promoter of the ideology that had torn Europe apart. For the next 3 years, she was moved between various internment camps, a prelude to her day of reckoning. When she finally faced a German denazification court in 1948, Margarete presented herself as a simple nurse and mother, claiming ignorance of politics and the true nature of her husband's duties. But investigators had read her wartime letters. They saw not an oblivious bystander, but a woman deeply enmeshed in the Nazi network, a willing beneficiary of its crimes. The court declared her a major offender, one of the most severe classifications. Her sentence was 4 years in prison, with credit for time already served, a minor punishment for complicity in such monumental evil, but more than enough to dismantle the life she had once known. Upon her release, Margarete Himmler effectively ceased to exist. She vanished from the public eye, adopting a new name and retreating into a quiet, isolated life in Munich. While her daughter Gudrun would spend a lifetime defending her father's name, remaining fiercely loyal to his dark ideals, Margarete never re-emerged from the shadows. She lived out her days in obscurity, a ghost of a fallen regime, until her death in 1967. For some, the war's end brought no closure, only a profound and haunting silence. It was a void where answers should have been, a space filled with rumor and uncertainty, where a life could be suspended between hope and despair. This was the world that awaited Gerda Bormann. Her husband, Martin Bormann, had been Hitler's shadow, the quiet gatekeeper to the Führer's inner sanctum. As private secretary, he controlled access, signed off on catastrophic orders, and wielded immense power from behind the scenes. His influence was a ghost in the machine of the Third Reich, yet when that machine finally broke in 1945, Bormann simply dissolved into the chaos. The last confirmed sighting placed him near Berlin's Lehrter station on May 2nd, attempting to flee the city's ruins alongside other high-ranking officials. Some whispered he was cut down by Soviet fire. Others insisted he had escaped, a phantom slipping through the cracks of a collapsing world. By the time of the Nuremberg trials, his whereabouts were a complete mystery. In 1946, he was tried in absentia and sentenced to death, a judgment passed on a man who might already be dead. For Gerda, the not knowing became its own form of imprisonment. She was left to raise their 10 children alone, burdened by a name that was no longer a name, but a stain known across the globe. While whispers placed her husband in South America, living under a new identity, Gerda refused to believe he was gone. She lived as if he might one day walk through the door. Her children wrestled with this dark inheritance in their own ways. Some sought distance, while one son, Martin Bormann Jr., pursued a radically different path. He became a Catholic priest, dedicating his life to reconciling the terrible legacy his father had left behind. But as the world debated Martin's fate, Gerda fell gravely ill with cancer. She died later that year at just 46, her loyalty to her husband unwavering to the end. The mystery, however, would not linger forever. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1972, construction workers digging near Lehrter Station unearthed human remains. It was the very spot where Bormann was last seen. DNA testing in the 1990s delivered the final stark confirmation. He had died in May of 1945, biting down on a cyanide capsule as Soviet troops closed in. The truth had finally surfaced, but it arrived far too late for the woman who had waited for it. In the ruins of the Reich, some loyalties refused to be extinguished. For certain women, belief was the last thing they had left, and Ilse Hess was one of them. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, had stood at the very heart of Nazi Germany as Hitler's deputy Führer, one of his most devoted followers. But in 1941, he embarked on a bizarre and solitary mission, piloting a small aircraft across the North Sea to Scotland. He claimed he came to negotiate peace and end the bloodshed. Instead, British forces arrested him on the spot. In Berlin, the Führer's fury was absolute. Hess was publicly declared insane. his name becoming a source of deep shame for the Nazi leadership. After the war, he faced judgment at Nuremberg, where he was found guilty of crimes against peace and conspiracy. The verdict was life in prison, a sentence he would serve in the grim fortress of Spandau for more than 40 years. Ilse, meanwhile, was arrested in 1945, along with many women connected to the Nazi inner circle. She was eventually classified as a lesser offender and, after a period of detention, released. But her ordeal did not lead to repentance. Instead, it hardened her resolve, transforming her into a tireless crusader for her husband's name. For the rest of her life, she argued that his flight to Scotland was a heroic act of peace, not treason. Through interviews, letters, and published works, she portrayed him as a misunderstood patriot who had tried to save Europe from itself. When Rudolf died in 1987, officially by suicide, Ilse's conviction never wavered. She continued defending his legacy until her own death in 1995, a lonely voice for an ideology the world had long since buried. In the long shadow of the swastika, not every woman stood as a silent accomplice. Some chose a path that diverged completely from the world they knew, a world apart from the ideology their husbands served. Emily Schindler was one such exception, a woman who refused the gilded cage of complicity. While her husband, Nazi Party member Oskar Schindler, moved in the circles of power, she worked in the shadows of his factory, a quiet force saving more than 1,000 Jewish lives. It was Emily who found them food, Emily who hid them from patrols, risking her own life with every clandestine act. After the war, their flight to Argentina brought not relief, but a slow descent into hardship. Oscar's business ventures crumbled, and he eventually abandoned her, leaving Emily to a life of stark poverty. While the world would come to celebrate his name, she survived by raising animals, her heroism forgotten, her days spent in quiet solitude in a land whose language she never mastered. Her story would only surface in the 1990s, decades after the world had moved on. But where one woman chose quiet courage, another embraced a chilling devotion. Lena Heydrich, wife of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, spent her life polishing the legacy of a monster. After his assassination in 1942, she raised their children to venerate a man the world condemned. Though arrested after the war, she was never charged, eventually remarrying and settling on the quiet island of Femar. Yet her silence was only temporary. In the 1970s, she spoke with pride of her late husband, publishing a book that portrayed one of history's most brutal men as a misunderstood leader. To the very end, she showed no remorse, no flicker of shame. Others navigated the post-war world by simply vanishing. Margaret Speer, wife of Hitler's chief architect Albert Speer, wrapped herself in a cloak of impenetrable silence. When her husband stood trial at Nuremberg and received a 20-year sentence for his confessed guilt, she was conspicuously absent. She wrote no letters, gave no interviews, and offered neither support nor condemnation in the press. Upon his release from prison in 1966, they reunited, but the years had carved a chasm between them. He was a celebrity author, a public penitent. She remained a private woman, lost in the background. Her death in 1980 earned her little more than a passing mention in his celebrated memoirs. For some, however, silence was not a choice, but a crushing consequence. Annie Brandt's world imploded when her husband, Rudolf Brandt, was tried and executed in 1948 for his role in Himmler's ghastly medical experiments. In an instant, her life was obliterated. Her home and property were seized, her movements monitored for years. The Brandt name became an indelible stain, a mark of pure horror. Unlike others who defended their husbands or faded into obscurity, Annie simply disintegrated into the silence of shame. She never remarried, never spoke to the press, and slowly withdrew even from her own family, crushed by a burden too heavy to carry in the light of day. In the ruins of a fallen Reich, the silence was its own form of judgment. For some, the shame was a burden too heavy to bear in public. Traudl Junge, though not a wife, stood at the very center of this storm. As Hitler's personal secretary in her early 20s, she had typed his final will in the stale air of the Berlin bunker, one of the last to see him alive. Captured first by the Soviets and later interrogated by the Americans, Junge faced no criminal charges. Yet she was imprisoned by a single haunting question for the rest of her days. Should she have known? In later interviews, she confessed a profound guilt, not for her actions, but for her inaction, for failing to ask, for refusing to see the truth until it was far too late. Others, like Henriette von Schirach, fell from a far greater height. Once a personal friend of Hitler and wife to Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Hitler Youth, she had lived at the apex of Nazi royalty. Their world was a glittering facade of power and privilege, but it shattered in an instant. With her husband sentenced to 20 years in prison, Henriette was arrested in 1945 and held for months. Allied interrogators ultimately declared her a fellow traveler, not a war criminal, but a willing supporter of the regime. Though she divorced her husband and attempted a new life, the past was a shadow she could never outrun. She would later write of being blinded by the glamour, a self-serving admission for damage already done. While some spoke of regret, others chose absolute silence, their stories nearly vanishing from history. Ingeborg Weber-Dönitz was the wife of Karl Dönitz, the man Hitler named as his successor. After Dönitz briefly led Germany and was sentenced to 10 years at Nuremberg, his wife retreated into obscurity. She gave no interviews, made no public appearances, and offered no comment on her husband's role in the regime. Living quietly with her children until her death in 1962, she left behind almost no public records, no books, no final statements. For some, fading into the background was the only path to survival. The suffering did not end with that generation. Their children grew up under the weight of inherited names, haunted by crimes they never committed, and a public judgment they could not escape. But as the 1960s and 70s arrived, Germany itself began to change. A new generation, unburdened by direct complicity, began to demand answers about their parents' past. Protests erupted, books were published, and old trials were reopened. The carefully constructed silence around these women started to crack. Slowly, their stories resurfaced, not as tales of victimhood, but as testimonies from hidden witnesses. The release of Schindler's List in 1993 reminded the world of Emily Schindler. In 2002, the documentary Blind Spot gave Traudl Junge a platform to voice her profound regrets. The end of the war was more than a military defeat. For the wives of the Third Reich's leaders, it was a total collapse of identity. Having lived at the heart of a monstrous regime, they were now trapped between public hatred and private loss. Some took their own lives, others lost everything, but none could simply walk away from the darkness they had once called home.